Welcome to the series Viewing Multidimensional Poverty from Many Angles, coming to you virtually from Oxford, New York City, and Washington, D.C. I'm Sabina Al-Khair and direct the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, OPHI, along with the Institute for International Economic Policy, or IIEP, of the George Washington University, and the Human Development Report Office of the UNDP. We're bringing you today's event entitled Measuring the Statistical Capacity of Nations by our very own James Foster of George Washington University, with a commentary by Pali Lehohla, Research Associate at OPHI and former Statistician General in South Africa. In just a moment, I'll turn the podium over to James. But before, I'd like to mention that next week, we take a break in our series and reconvene on the following Monday, the 8th of November, when Borga and D'Ambrosio will present their joint paper on social protection and multidimensional poverty. And our series will continue thereafter on a weekly basis. If you have to miss an event, it is available on the YouTube channel IIEPGW. So James Foster really needs no introduction, but just for some updates, he is the current Vice Dean of the Elliott School, the Oliver T. Carr Professor of International Affairs and Professor of Economics at the George Washington University. He's also Research Associate with us at OPHI in Oxford University. And he has always worked on using economic tools to evaluate and enhance the well-being of people, beginning with his joint 1984 Econometrica paper with Joel Greer and Eric Thorbecke on poverty measurement, which remains one of the most highly cited papers, and introduced a class of measures that was both axiomatically rigorous and also has become very widely used. He's also worked on economic inequality with Amartya Sen, on the distribution of human development with Luis Felipe Lopez Calva and Miguel Tsekeli, on multidimensional poverty with us, and on literacy with Kaushik Basu. And so his work, of course, underlies many different measures in this field. And whereas today he will present a new approach to measurement applied to the statistical capacity of nations, that builds on many different applications of measurement technologies that he has designed in a theoretical framework and have been widely used elsewhere. James received his doctorate in economics from Cornell University and also has a doctorate honoris causa from Universidad Autónoma de la Salle Hidalga in Mexico. So without further ado, let me turn it over to James for today's presentation. James.
Excellent. Well, great to be here. Thank you so much for having me, myself and you and others and Kyle and the rest. It's really great to be here. I'm going to talk about a paper today that's quite different in the sense that it goes outside sort of an area of comfort for me. It's more in the area of our discussant, Pali Lehohla, since he used to run statistics back in South Africa. So, I mean, I'm treading lightly as I say things, and I hope Pali will fix if I go in the wrong direction. But let's begin. This paper applies those multidimensional techniques that we've been using in this series, the seminar. It applies it to something called a Statistical Performance Index, or SPI. This index is designed to evaluate the capacity of a country's national statistics system to produce the data and statistics needed for policy. So in many ways, this is actually quite an incomplete paper. It was written and then sat for about maybe about 4 months. And then one of the co-authors randomly picked it up and submitted it to a journal where it was accepted. The rest of us were surprised because we hadn't finished it. Nonetheless, we're happy to let it go to the journal and come out so that other people can see some of our ideas. There are some aspects, however, that are even self-contradictory in the paper itself. In some parts, it says that every variable is going to be 0, 1, and then it turns out to be a scored variable. Sorry about that. I'll explain it during today's discussion. It takes some really key, I think, steps forward in the application of the intentional measurement approach, an approach which was discussed in the last Human Development Report, at least mentioned, as being one of the ways of thinking about how the Human Development Index was created. It's a process for keeping goals and objectives in mind when creating metrics. So we want to highlight also the use of nested weights, which you've seen in the MPI. It turns out that it really is helpful to think of things in a nested way when creating metrics. And then it highlights, it shows a novel link between binary data and scored data. The way that a lot of these data points were brought into the picture was that people at the World Bank had said, well, if we have this, we'll give it a 0. If we have this, we'll give it a 1. Have this, we'll give it 0.3, etc. And when you arbitrarily score things without any real reason, then everyone can arbitrarily ask you, why did you arbitrarily score it in that way? And so part of the idea of this paper is to provide a structure that at least constrains the folks to think through what it means to go a little bit more one way or less the other way, actually constrains you so that you can't make those changes. You have to have some coherent framework from which to draw a score, if you see what I mean. And the paper also created a potentially useful index that's, I would argue, is quite useful in the age of the SDGs. But everything remains a work in progress, and I'll show you how much a work in progress as we move forward. All right. I think everyone in the room would agree that a country's NSO, the part of the organization for the government that works with statistics, but also the NSS as a whole, plays a crucial role in producing data needed for policy and SDGs and allowing people to make the right decisions, et cetera, et cetera. In fact, a low capacity NSS impacts the country's very set of possibilities for data, for development. In other words, if you have low capacity, then it means that you're going to get worse data, which leads to poor decisions and puts you in a bad equilibrium, which I think is a very interesting poverty trap that I hadn't seen before. Maybe Pali knows about it, but it does seem to be a pretty obvious problem that can occur in many, many countries. There is a need for more global public goods, especially in light of the SDGs. Do you remember that data revolution thing that was supposed to be going on? This is a way for giving some voice to that need, for discussing that need in a more transparent way, in a way that leads to perhaps action. And there's a need for a metric to monitor a country's progress in this space. Either the country itself may find it useful, or international organizations that are trying to help out may find it useful as well. By the way, there's a big elephant in the room that private sector innovations are rendering the state to be second in terms of their ability to collect data on people. So where will it all go? Maybe we can hear from some of us in today's discussion. Now, other metrics exist, including the World Bank previous Statistical Capacity Index. It was, however, criticized for having a bunch of missing dimensions, too little coverage, not enough countries, and no prioritization over components. I mean, it found a bunch of variables and basically took a mean of them. So that may not be the way to go. These are the critiques, really, that are addressed here, that no real thought was given about structure or properties of the index. What characteristics should an index actually have in order to be useful? What are the implications for its structure? And can intentionality as a whole help create better measures? So this is at once a case study and something that I hope we can all learn from in terms of applying an approach of intentional measurement. Okay, so as I said, here's the contribution to the paper. You want to contribute to the process of measurement, creating an alternative multi-dimensional metric with many uses. that has been constructed using this approach and illustrate how the approach works. And then some insight we can all take home from this, which I hope will come out in discussion. From the contrast with the MPI, here we have a country as a unit. Is there a need for identification? Maybe not, maybe so. Nested weights are being used as disciplinary structure. And there's this really interesting thing that has been pointed out before by some a student of mine, Krisanti Hatsumuzuru, in which if you have subsumed variables that are kind of nested within each other. Here's the first one. In order to get to the second one, you have to have the first. In order to have the third one, you have to have the second and the first. It kind of creates a pseudo cardinality when you take the standard approach of applying equal weights across indicators or across variables. So this is really an interesting kind of new twist on the technology. So intentional measurement, let's talk a little bit about that. There are always many ways of measuring something, right? So this approach sets down the essential elements for the exercise you're engaging in. It guides the index construction. It ensures that the metric matches your intentions. So you don't wind up with something that just doesn't fit or may lead to even bad outcomes. There have been many cases of that recently as large organizations take major metrics that they've been using for a while and say, nope, we're going to pull that and it's not going to be used anymore, not going to be produced anymore. Why? Because it wasn't perhaps thought through or purpose. It was good for the purpose. Let's see now. So here are the main steps of intentional measurement. First of all, what are you trying to measure here? So this is really helpful in orienting the overall process and also in communication, because you can take that idea, the concept of what's being measured and communicate it. All right, for what purpose? What are we putting this thing together for? Where are we going to use it? Who's going to use it? How is it going to be used? It helps in the construction, because of the construction of the index or the unit of analyses or the indicators or the variables. If they're not right, then you're in trouble. 3, desiderata, and this is where something that we've used again and again in multidimensional measurement, pre-axioms that ensure that the measurement approach will be fit for purpose. No surprises at the end of the day, because you've thought what you wanted ahead of time and you've ensured during construction that it's there at the end of the day. Next, conceptual space. Where are we measuring this in? Are there identifiable dimensions that make sense, that are kind of equally important to the overall exercise? That's a goal that Tony Atkinson has, I think, led us to over the years, and which we've absconded with in our nested approach. That will be central to what we use here. But first, you need to have a set of dimensions or pillars or something that you can hang your hat as being equally important to the concept. Then you fill it out with variables and the index. You fill out the indicators, combine it into an overall metric. Finally, when you have the metric in hand, you can then start saying, well, does this metric actually seem rigorous? Does it fulfill the kinds of axioms we would expect a measure of this sort to satisfy? And when I say axioms, I mean both the mathematical structures that people use all the time, but also just nuggets of policy. I mean, what do you want this thing to measure? If so, then it should go up when that improves, or go down, right? You should be able to figure out the direction it should change under certain conditions. And also, what don't you want to measure? What should be hidden from view when you're measuring what you're focused on? And so forth. So the consistency side says, well, when you're measuring overall, how do you want it to be broken down In what useful ways can you take the overall measure and convert it to sub-indices, if you will, and then build them back up in a consistent way? That's really helpful for policy analysis, as we've seen with the MPI. So what is the concept being measured here? It's statistical capacity. It's the ability of an NSS to sustainably collect, compile, and disseminate data to inform national and international policy decisions. Now, there is a distinction here between capacity and what we'll be using, which is performance. In fact, we're going to call it statistical performance index to represent that fact. So it's kind of like analogous to capabilities versus functionings. You know, capabilities are really hard to measure. So we compromise. We focus on the observable characteristics of an NSS using kind of performance in various levels as a proxy for capacity. Now, obviously, you might be able to get more information by going to experts who know that, well, this country has a great statistical office and it's going great guns, and you don't see it in what they're doing right now, but it will happen to improve things later on. And you also might be caught by some country that's really doing well now, really doing poorly now, but has a history of doing really, really well. And so getting beyond that can be helped by listening to experts. But there are problems, and those problems have to deal with objectivity, have to deal with able to replicate what you found before, and all kinds of other criteria we'll talk about later. So we're going to just pull back and be modest and focus on things that are observable, on various types of performances that the NSS actually is showing that are able to be seen. So why do you have such an index? Why do we bother? Well, to assess the statistical capacity within and across nations, and really to monitor the needs of countries and the improvements they're making, right? I mean, it seems natural. Now, who uses it? Well, it'll be countries themselves, but also international organizations that are trying to help out. The desiderata, and we'll pause on this topic for a while. These are the characteristics you want for the metric. It really is important to include these pre-axioms or guiding principles to help make later choices. I'll try to give you some indication of that. We don't have too much time, so I won't be able to. Many of these pre-axioms just seem too basic to write. Why would you ever write that down? Don't waste my time. Well, because if you don't write them down and check them off, you can make really big mistakes. And there's a recent one I can show you by the World Bank. I won't go into it too far, but I'll mention it. So here's the list, which you can compare to the kind of MPI list that we've used before. It's a little different. I'll just go through it, and then we'll go through what it means in this context. Simple, coherent, motivated, rigorous, implementable, replicable, incentive consistent. Wow. All right, let's go through each. To be simple, we want this approach to be understandable and easy to describe to others, because heck, communication is important. And by communicating this or having it easily communicated, it encourages participation by stakeholders. In fact, that's part of the theory of change of metrics. How do you get things going? How do you make action take place? It's because people understand it, they want to work with it, they then try to improve it, and things change for the better. It also extends to where the data are coming from and how it links to the index. Sort of transparency of where it's from, credibility of the data, because that can undermine an index quicker than anything. So it should be included in this categorization. Now, how should it be done? Well, you clearly represent the structure and the elements. Sometimes a graphical representation is useful, and you may see this again and again with MPI. Oftentimes, an intuitive description being available in words or a simple formula can do the trick. If you don't have this particular characteristic, the index and the entire approach may be easily ignored or dismissed. Coherent. It has to conform to a common sense notion of what's being measured. Why? To authentically capture what you're trying to measure, okay? If it doesn't conform to a common sense notion, you're going to be trying to convince people this is the right way of looking at it. It ain't going to work. How do you do this? Well, often you just state it in plain English, and then you argue that it's a credible representation. For instance, poverty has multiple deprivations. The present case, statistical capacity is evidenced by products and processes. If not, well, you might have a really good measure of a wrong thing. Motivated. It has to fit the purpose for which it's been developed. Why? Well, you got to keep that purpose in mind. Okay. If it doesn't fit the purpose, it's going to be useless. So how do you do it? You check at every stage of development here. Monitoring a country's statistical capacity has to take into account data coverage and frequency, issues like that. If you don't have it fit the purpose, then it isn't, again, going to be useful in the entire reason for which it's being advanced. It has to be technically solid. Why? Well, could be measurement issues that cause problems. There are axioms can help. Statistical properties are needed. How do you do it? You build with these in mind and you double check. And if not, it can be embarrassing. For instance, if you use ordinal data as if it's cardinal, that's embarrassing. I know a Nobel Prize winner who did that, and it was embarrassing. So we don't want to do that. Likewise, the measure can be sensitive, hence measuring the wrong thing. That is not going to be good. You might get non-robust results just because the structure is weak. It must be operationally viable. This is pretty obvious. Purely theoretical measures don't cut it, not in the real world. So how do you make it work? You identify data having the right qualities, sufficient coverage, homogeneous across space and time, and very often you kind of need it to be publicly available. That's very helpful, in fact. Otherwise, lots and lots of desiderata or characteristics won't be possible. And very often you actually have to compromise. You don't put down an index that's oh, I hope I can do that, right? This ensures that it is available now, and you're going to have to cut through some of your desires, what you want in this index. You just got to compromise. And if you don't do it, then you can't sustainably produce a metric. Special in-depth studies could be the basis of the metric, but they have high cost and are idiosyncratic. They can lead to all kinds of non-robustness problems. Replicable. It must be easily replicable. Why? Well, because metrics are not produced just once. They're produced again and again. Moreover, even if they are produced once, you don't want them to be just calculated once. Other stakeholders want to be going through it and checking out, because other eyes are useful. So you need to have it, the possibility of being able to replicate it with information given in an available source. How do you do it? Well, maintain the data qualities over time. That's part of it. Lots of other issues, but that's one of the big ones. If not, you get inconsistent or misleading results. Final one here is kind of special and thrown on because we're dealing with countries. It must respect country incentives. Now, why is this? Because the change agents, countries, need to be able to connect their actions and the change in the metric, right? If not, then why bother? How do you do it? Well, focus a little bit more on absolute rather than relative criteria. There have been many cases where the goalposts change on countries and they say, forget about it. I'm not going to bother trying to improve this because I can just attribute it to having changed due to the way that the measure has been restructured over time. If you have a good functional form to support this particular characteristic, then good things can happen. If not, it disrupts accountability. Countries ignore or give up. As I said, goalposts that depends on other countries' achievements can really mess things up. Yes, a country does objectively better in many dimensions, and yet the index registers a downward change. It's worse. I don't know if Pali can tell us if he's faced that situation, but I expect that many countries have faced it with certain measures. So those are the desiderata. What are the remaining elements? Conceptual space and dimensions. Motivating idea, evaluate the SC, statistical capacity, in terms of the range of products and the processes that it uses to produce and disseminate them. So it's really kind of viewed as a production process with 4 components: technology used to generate the statistical products, say intermediate products like census and like surveys. This is used by specialists or people who can handle them. Then final products like key statistics for the public or for public fora, for SDGs. And then on top of all of that, a dissemination process that allows it to get out there, to be available for people to make use of. So 4 dimensions are given as methodology standards and classifications, which provide information on the technology, censuses and surveys, which are the intermediate products, availability of key indicators, final products, and then dissemination practices and openness, the extent to which you have effective dissemination. It's on a website. Note there are all kinds of missing dimensions. You don't have flexibility or the ability of the NSF to actually adapt to changing circumstances. Sounds more like capabilities, doesn't it? Hard to know what this will be. Likewise, statistical infrastructure, the inputs available to the NSS, again, may not be that observable, etc. So we just throw it out because we can't go there yet. Variables and index. The directions here are indicated by the desiderata. The variables have to be coherent with the concept, dimensions, and are publicly available. The aggregation method should be simple but rigorous. So what is the nature of variables here? Well, in our conception, each was just a standard yes/no question. For instance, do you use a modern system of national accounts, right? And that could be made precise. Have you had a population census in 10 years? Do you have a poverty measure according to the SDGs? So those types of questions, these are the illustrations of them. So it's available, most of them are available from NSS websites or from the World Bank, IMF, ILO, they're reported to. And that makes it pretty easy to gather the data. Natural aggregation that's used frequently in the 0-1 case is the counting method. Atkinson describes it, but it all comes down to weights or values for each variable. So let's talk about that a second. Here are the variables. Let's say we have V many achievements. I'll have it in the 0-1 case. 1 means test is met, 0 means not. Okay, counting method uses a vector of weights, W. Each one's positive, sums to a constant. And a weighted mean function. What I've done is used it in a general form where I take the weight on the first one divided by the total weight, so you get a normalized weight. And that is the weight on the first achievement all the way out to the Vth achievement. So it's basically a weighted mean. That's what this measure structure looks like. So it's a sum of the values of the achievements as a share of the max value. Well, which weights? That's the action, right? So let me give you an example. I'll determine a tree. It'll have dimensions, subdimensions, and finally variables. So the headline is given here with the weight of 1. There are 4 dimensions for this measure, as you saw, equal weights a la Atkinson, a quarter apiece. There's a subdimension over here. Actually, there's a subdimension over here that I'm going to ignore right now. But subdimension, 2 categories that make sense, and they have half the weight each. And then variables. Well, here you have 12 variables, 1/4 divided by 12, and you get 1/48, all the way across doing the same exercise to get the implied weight from the structure. Once you have that, the SPI is given as follows. Does that make sense? It's a composite index using 0, 1 variables with weights that are constructed in a way that adds a bit of structure and preserves the integrity that each dimension is equally important. So I'll mention this just quickly. It turns out that you can go between nested variables and scored variables quite easily. If there are 2 dichotomous variables, one subsumed in the other, there's an equivalence between equal weights and linear scoring. So here we have system of national accounts in use. If you use the first approach, you ask a question, yes or no. That's the answer. You have a weight of a half. If you use the second approach, which is older, right, or better, you answer yes or no. You put down, that has half a weight. And what's interesting about 2 questions with half weight, one of which is subsumed in the other, really, because you have to have the second in order to be the first, right, is that it leads to a kind of ability to score or combine variables, so that if you have any other approach besides these 2, you get nothing. If you have just this lower level one, you have a half, and higher level one gives you 1. So it's a linear, if you will, linear sort of structure linking from achievements to the score. Okay, so this is a really interesting outcome of the kind of subsumed variable, and it was used quite a lot in the Better Jobs Index. You can also do it for 3 variables. Forget about it, let me go on. So here's the actual structure with scored variables. You go through all of this, look at the dimensions, etc., the number of variables, and then you notice that, in fact, these were scored variables that I was indicating. Within them, you'd have to have 2 variables here, 2 here, 3 here, etc., to create the scored variables using just a standard weighted approach with nested weights. It can be done, and it's outlined at the end of the paper. Let me just go on. I'm going to be working with the scored variables then. So axioms, we have a consistency axiom, which says that you can expand not just for one country, but to regions and measure regional statistical capacity. Now, there is a question whether you use population weights or country weights. That's a question. In our paper, we just basically did it by typical World Bank regions to get an idea of what the SPI that's created in the paper would yield. It is cool because you can then relate that to individual countries and come back out again to the region. Consistency axioms dig within the measure and look at a subset of variables, define statistical capacity subset index, CS, on that basis. These could be dimensional indices. We have 4 dimensions. Here are the 4 sub-indices. A given collection of mutually exclusive sets of variables, overall C is the weighted sum of these subset indices. That's what the breakdown by variables requirement holds with this index, and indeed can be shown to be a general result that we would like. So you can break down the headline by all sorts of ways, and that is really quite helpful for understanding where the problems are coming from. And this is a combined bit of data that it isn't given in the nice form that I would like, but at least it indicates the different regional MSc score or CS score or DPO score, AKI score. So you get a sense just by looking at the numbers. I know that they should probably be in the same order, so you could then imagine how you average them across SSA, 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 Sub-Saharan Africa, average those 4 heights, and that is the overall measure. There are axioms of dominance, of monotonicity. This is one of the dominance axioms. It tells you what you're looking for to measure. It helps you make sure that everything's incentive consistent. This, by the way, provides an incentive to update, because some of the variables here actually have a time limit, 10 years and so on. There's invariance axiom. We've had a consistency axiom, a dominance axiom, and an invariance axiom. Now, a kind of restricted symmetry that reminds you of something that was used in the Basu and Foster paper. If you rename the dimensions or the subdimensions within a dimension or variables within a subdimension, or if those variables are in a dimension where there are no subdimensions, then C is unchanged. Symmetry, but restricted. You can't just randomly go across where different weights are. I'll just throw down a couple of the results. I mean, this has South Africa in it, showing how high, this is actually quite a high number. South Africa comes in, Thailand down below magically is higher. I'm amazed at some of the numbers are quite low, some are in between. I'll continue. Some variables given. This is for censuses. You have a score of 1 if the population census is done in the last 10 years, population within the last 20, and so on. You see the idea here. And you can construct these from 2 separate yes/no questions or tests. And let me end on this interesting note, because actually, this whole framework was then taken up by the World Bank and then included in their index of the same name, it turns out. Didn't ask whether they could use it, but anyway, there it is. We have a new structure, however, with 5 pillars and 22 dimensions, etc. And I wanted to point out that in their discussion of this index, they say, but 8 of the dimensions do not yet have measurable indicators. Please see chart below. I mean, okay, which one of those characteristics is being violated here? All right, anyway, they do it for a good reason. They want to encourage discussion, but I will say that it isn't going to be a useful measure until they can apply it to data. Thank you very much for your patience. I turn it over to Pali Lehohla.
Thank you so much, James. That's a fantastic statement and overview of the Statistical Capacity of Nations and the SPI. So now we turn to our discussant, and many of you will know him, but Pali Lehohla is the former Statistician General of South Africa and the former head of Statistics South Africa for 17 years, from 2000 to 2017. And he's been many, many things. So he's co-chair of Paris 21. He was chair of the UN Statistics Commission. He was founding chair of the Statistics Commission of Africa, StatCom Africa. He chaired the Africa Symposium for Statistical Development. He was vice president of the ISI, the International Statistics Institute. He sponsored a young African statistician movement. He was an independent advisory group member, and he advised the UN Secretary Ban Ki-moon on the data revolution. He remains on the independent advisory board to the UN Secretary General on the health of mothers, adolescents, and children. He's active in the Africa Peer Review Mechanism and is widely recognized to be a thought leader in determinants and correlates of political economy of measurement, its applications and constraints. And Pali holds an honorary doctorate from the University of Stellenbosch. So Pali, James was giving us an indicator of the statistical capacity as somebody thinking about the political economy of measurement and also of its own ingredients. It would be lovely to hear your reflections. Over to you.
If you're talking, we can't hear you.
Yes, thank you very much. And thanks a lot, James, for these I mean, as you presented, I was reflecting. And I was wondering, how do I approach this subject? At the one level, as statisticians and dealing with things like a consumer price index, GDP, we are very excellent at measuring this. At the other level, when you have to measure across disciplines, there seems to be a problem. And where it has to measure the performance of the system, we've always known that Statistics Canada is almost the best. Statistics Sweden is very good. Australia statistics is very good. And we have never really thought about how this works as a league of, in the league tables. So your approach to this has really revealed a lot of areas that we have not gone towards. So I've just picked on the questions that you raised: what is being measured, the purpose of the index, the desiderata, the dimensions, the variables and aggregations, and so on. All those 4 points that you make, and the conclusions, and the results and the conclusions. And I ask myself as I go through this, what mischief are you looking at? And when I started unpacking this, I realized that there's really serious mischief that you are chasing here, and you are probably on the right path. When one looks at the steps of measurement in statistical operations, there is a prospective and a measure that looks backward, a retrospective one and a prospective one. And the statisticians, the measurers, come up to this point where it is retrospective. We look at the future with a rear view mirror. And of course, there is one which is prospective. And one of the things that you are looking at is, can I trust this machine? If you look at a vehicle outside, you are asking yourself, can it take me to destination A where I want to get? Is it possible to ask that question and a statistics office is able to say, yes, trust me, I'm a statistician, I'm a statistics officer? That's the question that we're asking. And what I'll go through is to say, well, it's your conjecture, it's your theory, because I think it's really a serious theory. It's not a conjecture, but probably it started as a conjecture. But is this theory holding? Is it not holding? Now, when we look at statistical production, and this is a statistical value chain, it's a new terminology, it's almost 10 years old. It looks at the plan, the design, build, collect, process, analyze, disseminate, archive. It's product focused. Can you, on the basis of this, say that this statistics, this institution can produce regularly? Can it be trusted? That's the question that you are actually asking. And then, of course, you evaluate. Now, way back when I was in Botswana, which was in a corner of South Africa, hiding there from Lesotho, Kaimbara and I, who was I was the director of the institution in 1991, we started asking ourselves questions around a national statistics system. And we started trying to define it then. And these are the definitions we put to it. Of course, these definitions we didn't document when we were in Botswana. We started formalizing the documentation when we joined Stats SA. And that's why it's dated 2000. But this was already in early 1990. A national statistics system is a system that has a coherent body of data. It consists of users, producers, and suppliers of data and information. It aims to ensure continuous coordination and cooperation among producers and users of official statistics in order to advance standardization, quality, consistency, comparability, and use of evidence as the basis for policy choices and decision-making, and avoid unnecessary and costly duplication. It's a long, but in the main, it says, do you have an institution that can be trusted in the future, that engages and involves? And then, of course, we went on to define this as well. What is very interesting is, of course, how do credible statistics obtained through, how do they get obtained? And here we are looking at what is the configuration, the National Development Plan, the medium-term framework. And the question was, who defines these things? Who defines what has to be measured? And clearly, the what of measurement is a matter of cabinet. We want to measure employment, we want to measure economy. But who determines what inputs or outputs, and who measures inputs and outputs? These are the questions that who determines the outcomes and who measures outputs and outcomes. And here is where the statistics institutions are. The determination of what is the political system, the how of it is in the realm of statistical offices. And then, of course, who handles the impact? It's policy research and citizenry. Now, then, of course, in the process, there are emerging data needs, and then, of course, the concept of data revolution. Now, what actually were the prime movers of what you are trying to, what you are talking to, James? Basically, the MDGs fostered design thinking and systems thinking. But MDGs were largely for poor developing countries, so the impact of systems thinking was not universalized. And this comes clearly in your results, that your measure is universal. It covers all countries, whereas the measure of the World Bank covered only a few countries that were either, 140 countries. And this has a genesis in the structure of the MDGs, but the MDGs by itself advanced design thinking and systems thinking. In the process of this, in the systems thinking, these were the kinds of things that the MDGs did in relation to data. Now, from MDGs to SDGs, there was a leapfrogging as well, because this involved all countries. And what happened is, of course, the 17 goals and so on. But in the process of measurement, something actually happened. In the design of thinking about measurement, something happened which fostered and enforced design thinking and system thinking, and thinking across subjects. Leave no one behind, equity, prosperity, and planet, invest in future capital. These are primarily major things: people, planet, and prosperity, and all that is a major outcome. And these outcomes are actually looked through these goals and, of course, the target areas. But all this cut across one the other. So the ontologies become very important, and the kind of language you use directs you to what the ontologies of these are. Now, here is an interesting statistic that captures what I've been saying. In fact, the 1958 first edition of the Statistics Organization of Statistics, which is a book that is compiled by the United Nations Statistics Commission, which is all the statistics offices of the world. They come every year. The 1958 first edition, after the Statistics Commission was established in 1947, didn't have a name, National Statistics System, or NSS. The 1980 second edition still didn't have a name, Statistical System, or National NSS. Stats SA in 2002, having been immersed in this kind of thinking in the 90s, we had 25 words in the document that I was preparing at Paris 21, at the meeting of Paris 21, where I actually put forward the idea of the National Statistics System. In 2003, the third edition of the Organization of Statistics only had 3 references to a national statistics system. The 2021 fourth edition, which is under construction, had 229 references to the national statistics system. and of course, 21 references to NSS. This evolution of the concept of systems meant that we are moving from a statistical service to a statistical system. It doesn't surprise, therefore, as you can see, why you are on the right track. You are actually looking and you have put your finger on the mischief, that the statistics offices were inward looking, focused on the product, including using the statistical value chain. And now they've been exposed that they don't have, and we don't have, therefore, a system of measuring the performance of the machine. That is, the organization in itself. Can it be trusted? Can it take the load? Or can we measure it only with its outcomes? Now, this actually talks to the theory of change, where you see what happened in the first phase. The organizations are generally young, they are creative, the leadership is loosely organized. Second phase looks at how do you create integrity. There's a measure of direction that has to be imposed on the institution. And here, I'm just giving you a review of how stats say. And when there is that direction, you provide direction and there's a lot of autonomy in the area. Then, of course, you have to delegate. And when you delegate, you also have to see how do you manage control? And that's where transformation moves. And then phase 4 is coordination. And this, once you start coordinating or looking at things, you lose control and you try to move into red tape. By phase 5, you actually want to collaborate. And the data revolution is there. And with the growth of data revolution, you can only manage through collaboration. And this is a complex system and must be measured in the dimensions that you have alluded to. So you are looking towards it. So what happened to stats? I just want to show here that there is a level of impact indicators, the outcome, the products, and then the process and the input. Here, what we see in terms of the impact indicators, we are looking at a better life for all. At the input level, you bring human capital, organizational, technological, and this part, who measures the measurers? Are they adequately equipped to do this work? At the level of process, is the statistical production processes, the development processes, and all those, innovation, cannot measure those. At the level of products and the level of outcomes, mostly this part has not always been measured in statistical organizations. What they've been concerned with have been outputs. But yes, today the organization can do very well. You do not know how resilient it is because this part is not measured. And James, you are on the right track. One of the interesting things was when I messed up the CPI, Consumer Price Index, and got it wrong for 14 months. And when this was uncovered, everybody was saying, oh, we never knew that it is these skunks that produce CPI. We always thought it was produced by the Reserve Bank. No wonder why. So you find out a lot of presumptions around who actually produces the numbers. Great. In fact, it is when things don't go wrong that is a signal that you are doing very well. When they go wrong, then you know that you are very important. But not only that you are very important, in fact, your greatness was actually assigned to somebody else. This is this busy slide here shows you the system in Korea.
Right.
Which actually
I think we're going to wind up just a little bit, Padi. So if you move towards
I will now. I will. That's Korea. And you know, the system is science-based. Because it's science-based, we need to know what it addresses. And the measurement that we are bringing to bear is very important. And that has to be understood. And what are the implications technologically? Those are the questions we have to ask. And of course, I think in terms of what you are measuring, you are bringing to bear, is the question of coordination. What are the mandates, and are those mandates measurable? Is the production predictable? Has it secured public trust? Does it embrace big data and data revolution? What is the culture? And what is required is the new form of leading and leadership in multidimensional systems. And what we have brought to bear to statistics offices, it is that attribute of multidimensionality. So let me thank you for bringing this very painful subject to the surface and exposing the statistical systems to a new way of thinking that may make them thrive as they look at data stewardship. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Pali, for a real fascinating exposition on how the history of StatSA and its innovation in statistical systems has echoes with the discussion that underpins this ongoing interest in measuring and comparing statistical capacity, going beyond the countries that were focused on earlier, looking at systems measurement, and also looking at, in a sense, the substructure, even below the dimensions that are currently in the Statistical Capacity of Nations paper. So I'll turn it briefly over to James for any responses to Pali, and then we will open the floor for questions. You can put them in the chat, or you can raise your electronic hand. James.
No, I mean, that was just wonderful, Pali. I really appreciate it. Amazing, the history, and seeing the discussion that you gave 21 years ago, it lives like today. It is probably better than any of the other sources that I read on this. So I need to go back and look at your original sources. It's just really, really good. And tell me, as we move forward, I'm always going to be interested in increasing the pain to any extent I can, if it does good in the world. So please reveal the pain points so that they can become incorporated into, I think, an effective index. The one problem that I'm always going to see with this is trying to get inside the NSS or NSO. You know, how do we do that? How do we get into the processes, the capability, the resilience, all of those things? Are there observables we can draw from? And so I'm going to turn it back to you with that question.
Well, as your critique rightly says, that this whole assessment can be very expensive and very tiresome, and you never know whether you are getting the right answer because of bureaucratic. You want some objective observation of things. I mean, so you are likely not to get the full answer. But your analysis, the direction you are pursuing is the right direction. And I think this has to be embedded in the peer review processes that organizations should use to measure. I mean, if you look at Canada, for instance, Canada was a very strong statistics office. At the level of product and production and systems internally, very, very strong. But at the level of political interface, Canada faced a crisis of the census, that the minister said, no, you are doing away with the long form. You should only use the short form. That crisis percolated into the crisis of leadership. Felegi was the head of Statistics Canada for 25 years. He had served in that organization for 60 years. When he left, after 25 years, he was followed by no less than 3 people who had to change. He was followed by Munir, Smith, and now the current head of the statistics office. So in less than 10 years, Canada saw a change in leadership that was very rapid. So what you are looking at actually assesses those things that are not very visible. That the stay in office of a leader has its own ways of creating stability, but when they quit, turmoil starts. So this is a very important subject. And it's not only that that happened. It was Canada was tested on the long form, short form. When Smith had to leave, he was tested on the shared services, where he was saying, "I've taken an oath that the data of Canadians will be protected," and the shared services opened that space. But in its place, there was a lot more work, which actually probably made Canada statistics even stronger, because they have the reach in terms of their Statistics Act of anyone who happens to be in the line of service, including the shared services, that they'll protect the integrity of the data. So there are these things that are evolving in the best of family. So you are on the chasing the right mischief. Now, when I've just published in my weekly column here, the president comes and says we are having an unprecedented recruitment of the youth into our system. Now, I've just written that there's nothing further from the truth than that, because the president now comes with his own numbers. I do not know how he got those numbers. The statistician general shows that the number of youth are in an unprecedented levels of unemployment. In fact, that is increasing. So when you have this thing which is not a system, where people don't understand that the institution is the aggregator of all aggregators, where the private sector has its own numbers, and the president then he has his own numbers. And because they are looking at their own numbers, where the sources are not even known, the methods are not, then you have a serious problem to the system. So I just published that today, and I'll share it with you.
Okay, thanks.
So
Thank you so much, Badi. It's fascinating, the history of statistics, and also the just passion which is put into creating independent, viable, credible systems. And so this is a really interesting paper from an institutional perspective. While others are putting questions into the Q&A, James, I'm going to have one. And first of all, it's to appreciate this. We've been also wrestling with a SAS implementation index in Pakistan. So I basically have two questions for you. One about the substructure and the scores, and the other about disaggregation. So in terms of the substructures, if you have two different variables, let's say it's nutrition and severe nutrition. And so if somebody has severe undernutrition, that's a deprivation, that's a bad. And that would be, in a sense, the second category. If they're undernourished, then that's the first category. So it could be 1/2 if they are undernourished, and an additional 1/2 if they're severely undernourished. But the question that I have is, how wedded are you to the particular nested weighting structure where they must be equal? Because in effect, are we at risk of cardinalizing ordinal data, but with a very particular structure? So if it's no longer BMI, but if it is a type of sanitation, so if it is a protected pit latrine, or if it is open defecation, so ordered cardinal data, or ordered categorical data, then we're imposing a particular nested weighting structure on them. And I wonder about that approach versus thinking normatively in the same way that we would think across weights of indicators, and maybe possibly adjusting the structure for that. So I don't know if that's an apt parallel, but I'd be very interested in the response. And the second is something about disaggregation. So if you consider Indonesia, for example, where statistics are also produced subnationally, as in many other countries at state levels, and there might even be state level statistical offices or staff. would there be some variables where the national aggregate would actually be created of the disaggregated input from these subnational structures? Let's say one dimension was created from those and the other 3 dimensions were created from national structures. Has there been that discussion about pulling it apart and bringing some of the going beyond the one country as a unit of analysis, but where some indicators are only available at the national level and others for subnational levels? And for anyone else who has questions, please put them in the Q&A and not in the chat box. I do apologize. Over to you, James.
Okay, great. Yes, it is a trick. It is. It's a restrictive trick. And it's intentionally restrictive, but it can be relaxed. And it can be relaxed in line with normative thought. If you think that it is more, the curvature should be a particular way, then there are great possibilities for thinking through alternative ways of taking that into account. And, you know, we've done it with the more recent measure that talks about inequality sensitivity. And inequality sensitivity could be part of the game. It's another way of looking at a kind of cardinality. It's not exactly, but I agree with you. This is a trick. It is a way, however, that allows us to stop the randomness when people don't have a strong normative position, right? But very often they just throw stuff down and then, okay. So I think it forces you to say, okay, you're going to be forced into this with this structure. Is that something that's acceptable? Does that make sense? And that process, which oftentimes doesn't go into the mix, is forced to take place. I guess that's as good as I can say, because you're right. It is going to be a way of back-ending into these scores that are at different levels. But it also kind of makes sense if you actually take cardinality and disaggregate it. It's kind of like this. It's not unlike this in some sense. Is it right? Maybe not in the particular type of cardinality. Obviously, linear structures is what we're getting here. Linear scores, not with a curvature upwards or downwards. So that is about all I can say about the question, because it's a great one and it exposes the arbitrariness of it, but still the arbitrariness of it is what allows us to think beyond it in a sense. So going to the next, subnational, we thought about quite a lot in this. There are, you know, examples where you can think of sourcing. The only way is by sourcing subnationally. In fact, you think the mail service does it for the census, right? I mean, it's coming from individual self-reported statements by people in each state. So it's got to be a local thing in that sense, but not locally because it goes directly through mail to, or is collected by individuals. But I had thought of this at one point, seeing, well, maybe states obviously have censuses and they have over history, but you know, that's all gone away. A lot of the redundancy that we try to get rid of in creation of data is where the action is. So you don't want it to be so locally, you know, obtained, because the cost structure is just prohibitive. Better to have someone in the center going through the process and doing it. But where the interesting bit starts coming in is, to what extent do other structures start entering in the private sector? So where does that take place? Is the NSS taking into account all this wonderful stuff that might come through the private sector? Maybe it's a bad thing. So these normative issues start being asked, questions start being asked in that environment as well. So I don't think that we're ever going to use a decomposition within country. It just doesn't seem feasible. But you do use decompositions all over the place by going in reverse, building up to regional areas that have salience, that have cohesiveness, that have leagues of states that work together in important ways. That's, I think, where the action is, because then they can come and look downward again to see who is suffering at this point with respect to the various criteria. So that's my response.
Thank you so much. And the final question will come from Yanchun Zhang from HDRO, co-host of this event, and a statistician and another statistical voice. Yanchun, you have the podium.
Thank you so much, Sabina. Thanks very much, James. Thanks, Pali. Learned a lot today. I just have a policy-related question for James. As we often say, you cannot measure, you cannot improve something if you cannot measure it. So it's good to see this MPI, SPI as an improvement of SCI. But the next step, after you measure it, how to improve it, how to enhance the capability or capacity of National Statistics Office. I don't know whether the World Bank has been able to use the SCI, or what do you have in mind using SPI to improve the capacity of a National Statistics System or office? Also related, Pali shared a lot of experience from his previous work. What I have in mind is, how about the infrastructure? Often we say, a country needs to have the infrastructure, statistical infrastructure in place. From our observation, sustainability is about, as James presented, the achievements, but also about the process. If you don't have the sustainable infrastructure in place, it's very difficult to deliver consistent and sustainable positive outcomes. So how to incorporate this statistical infrastructure in your measurement? That's another question. Thanks, James.
Okay, thank you so much. On the last one, the different forms of infrastructure taken by different countries start getting you all involved in trying to equate things that look so different. And yet they are equatable. They are having the same impact. They are creating resiliency or the ability to respond or to change or to move forward. But yet they're different strategies of the same thing. And until we have a sense of that deep answer to that hard question, I'm not there yet. I think it's maybe by looking at outputs, maybe by looking at functionings, if you will, then people will reason that they need to create the very sort of capacities embodied in the infrastructure in order to achieve those regular production of output. And I believe they will, and I believe they do, and I think that's what Pali was talking about, some of that more in-depth discussion. In terms of, I have wonderful, wonderful writing here that answers your question thoroughly, but like, was it Galois or whoever it was that died young after solving the Fermat's second theorem in the, I can't read my writing right now. So if you could, yes, how does it lead to action? If it becomes salient, if a measure becomes salient, it becomes actionable very quickly if it becomes salient. Now, how does it become salient and to whom is the question? Obviously, the first question you were asking would have to do with the peers. It could have to do with just normal folks in the street who are concerned about such things as well. They may see the connection as to what's going on, but usually it's the upper policymakers and other folks that need to put pressure on this. There's another side of it too, the funding side, and that's where you have larger than national entities that are there to contribute and help and invest in countries. And it can be used there where you say, of course, this country is doing that much better than this one. And so we know that we need to focus on this one, but also we know how we need to focus on it, or at least what kinds of discussions and mischievous and difficult questions we need to raise as we talk to the folks there. Thank you.
Yes, can I just come in? I mean,
we're going to have to bring it to a close now, Paddy. But the panelists will find a link for the Afterglow. And for the rest, please do join us again in 2 weeks' time on the 8th of November with Borga and D'Ambrosio on social protection and multidimensional poverty. And thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to James, Padi Lehohla, to the other panelists and the participants. This has been a very dynamic exchange and really one way of trying to apply measurement techniques to a different suite of problems, and then think through from the angle of policy, from the angle of history, from the angle of embeddedness in institutions, what we can learn both in a measurement sense and in an action sense from this application. So thank you all so very much.